The shame enveloped the space. Do you still not understand your place, Janet? Gerald Hayes, the operations manager, sneered, with a voice full of disdain. You're nothing but a janitor. Nothing at all. Clean this floor again, until I can see my reflection clearly in it, or never come back here again. Sir, I've cleaned it many times already, Mary Williams replied calmly. Her voice still steady, despite the cruel insult. Without saying another word, Gerald grabbed a cup full of cold water, and deliberately poured it straight onto Mary's head. The cold water streamed down her hair. Over her face. Soaking her uniform. Collecting at her feet. On the newly cleaned, shiny floor. The sudden cold made her flinch. But what truly stunned her, was the deliberate cruelty of the act. Now you have something real to clean, Gerald mocked. Turning away, with a sense of triumph. But he couldn't have known that the woman he had just humiliated, wasn't just a frail janitor. But the very woman who had built this company from scratch. A woman with enough power, determination, and resolve, to bring his entire career crashing down in an instant. At the top floor of a skyscraper, in the heart of bustling New York City, Williams Innovation stood tall and authoritative. With its iconic logo, shining brightly every night. Behind this resounding success, was the extraordinary story of a woman named Mary Williams. Whom everyone in the industry referred to, with two words full of respect, the legend. Mary Williams was not born into wealth. At the age of 25, when society still held strong biases against black women, Mary dared to dream of creating her own financial tech empire. Starting with a small rented office in the suburbs. And little capital scraped together from friends. She worked tirelessly. Slowly turning her dream into reality. 35 years later. From the days when she had to sleep on her desk because she couldn't afford an apartment. To building a powerful fintech corporation worth billions of dollars. With thousands of employees worldwide. Mary never forgot her humble beginnings. But time does not spare anyone. And Mary was no exception. After more than 3 decades of dedication, she realized it was time to hand over the reins to the most trusted successor. Her only son, Robert Williams. Robert, well trained by Mary, had graduated from Harvard. With numerous outstanding achievements. He had been carefully mentored by his mother. To understand the core values of the company. Equality, creativity, and respect for everyone. However, what Mary did not foresee was that after stepping down from the leadership position, the company that had once symbolized innovation and social equality began to show dangerous cracks. Unsettling news started to filter through to her. From former loyal colleagues. Whispers about the arrogance of senior managers. The mistreatment of lower-level employees. Subtle discrimination. And a tense atmosphere of pressure. Led her to question. Could her son Robert still uphold the values she had taught him? As each day passed, Mary's unease grew. Unable to sit idly by. While the company she had built with so much effort was being destroyed by distorted values. Mary Williams made a bold decision. One no one expected. She would disguise herself as an ordinary janitor. And work in the very company she had founded. So she could witness the truth for herself. Mary knew, this act could put her in difficult and complex situations. But to her, nothing was more precious than the truth. And justice. Dressed in a janitor's uniform. Using the fake name Janet. The woman who had once stood at the pinnacle of success. Was about to embark on a journey she could not even predict. Confronting the truth. And seeking to restore the soul of her own creation. Williams Innovations. The decision was made. Mary Williams quietly began her plan. Not revealing it to anyone. Not even her son, Robert. On her first day back at Williams Innovations. under the guise of an elderly janitor named Janet. Mary's heart fluttered. With a mix of nervousness and uncertainty. Feelings she hadn't experienced in decades. That evening. The office lights dimmed, as employees began to leave. Mary entered through the staff-only entrance for custodians. The place was completely different from the image she had once remembered. A company that was the pride of her life. Now felt foreign. There were no more respectful glances. No more cheerful greetings from the managers. In her simple gray uniform, Mary immediately felt her invisibility. In the eyes of the young people rushing home. Her first shift began at 10 p.m. She was given a quick introduction. By a middle-aged man, the janitorial team manager. His cold demeanor was apparent. He handed her a cleaning cart. With a few supplies. And quickly walked away, offering no further instructions. Mary stood in the long empty hallway. Looking at the name tag on her chest. That read, Janet. Feeling both alienated, and saddened. Lost in thought. She noticed a figure approaching, from the end of the hallway. The footsteps echoed. With authority. And arrogance. It was Gerald Hayes. The new operations manager. Whom Mary had only heard of, through Robert. Gerald was about 45 years old. Tall. With slick-back light brown hair. And an impeccably dressed tie. With just one glance. Mary could sense the suffocating self-satisfaction. And authority. Emanating from him. Gerald stopped right in front of her. Scanning her from head to toe. Before speaking, in a condescending tone. New here, are you? We don't pay for slow old people. Work faster. I don't want to see a speck of dust around here. Mary tried to keep her voice steady. And replied politely. Yes sir, I'll be careful. Gerald gave her a mocking smile. Then turned away. Intentionally stepping on the area she had just cleaned. Leaving muddy footprints behind. Mary's heart tightened. At this open contempt. For a moment. She questioned whether this was the right decision. But she quickly regained her composure. She silently cleaned the floor again. Determined not to let this petty act sway her from her goal. Before her first shift ended. Mary had to face Derek Phillips. The young and stylish marketing director. Known for his sharp words, and trendy attire. Derek had just finished a late meeting. And seeing Mary cleaning the common area. Frowned in clear displeasure. Clean faster. I don't want to see you lingering by my office door. Do you know how important our work is? Without waiting for her response. Derek walked into his office, and slammed the door shut. The abrupt sound of the door closing. Was the clearest sign to Mary. That the culture of respect she had once built and was proud of. Had gradually eroded. Instead. There was an attitude of discrimination. Arrogance. And disdain for the manual workers. Those who were invisible. In the eyes of those with power. Mary stood still in the silent hallway. Her hand, once used to sign multi-million-dollar contracts. Now trembling slightly. On the rough handle of the mop. But then, she took a deep breath. Reminding herself, this was just the beginning. Determined, to uncover the truth about what was happening within her own company. Mary silently continued her work. She knew, the road ahead would be long. Full of challenges. And she might face things far worse than this. But for the future of Williams Innovations. For the honor and the values she had fought to protect her entire life. Mary understood. This was the moment she needed to be stronger than ever. The days that followed passed slowly. But for Mary, each minute was filled with heavy, bitter emotions. After the moment when Gerald and Derek left. She was no longer merely an observer. She had truly immersed herself in the invisible pains of the janitorial staff. What she saw was not just simple disrespect, but a whole culture of bitterness. A culture that dehumanized individuals. A culture that made her heart ache, as she realized it was eroding the very values she had once nurtured. The more she played the role of Janet, the more Mary understood why the janitorial staff always kept their heads down, working hurriedly, as though trying to avoid the gaze of management. They had no voice, no right to defend themselves. They existed within the grand corridors, yet were never truly seen by the arrogant, indifferent managers. On Thursday evening, while cleaning the elevator area on the 42nd floor, Mary witnessed Gerald Hayes publicly humiliate a young janitor named Maria. Maria was in her early 30s. A Latin immigrant, with a gentle face and a soft voice, always trying to avoid unnecessary conflict. At that moment, Maria accidentally dropped a small bottle of glass cleaner onto the floor, causing the liquid to splatter onto Gerald's shiny shoes. Gerald immediately exploded in anger, his voice echoing sharply in the empty corridor. "Do you know how much these shoes cost? Do you think you'll ever be able to pay for them? With a lifetime of cleaning?" Maria, terrified, repeatedly bowed her head and apologized. But Gerald was not so easily appeased. He walked up to her, his tone threatening. "People like you need to know your place. If this happens again, don't even think about coming back here." He then walked off, leaving Maria standing motionless in the corridor, tears welling up on her pale, fear-stricken face. Mary rushed over, gently comforting Maria, her heart aching as she watched the young woman tremble, wiping away her tears and continuing her work as if nothing had happened. Witnessing this, Mary realized that the decline of the company's culture was far worse than she had imagined. It wasn't just Gerald. Mary also quickly realized that Derek Phillips was another dangerous figure. Derek was smart, sharp, but his talent was accompanied by arrogance and a lack of empathy. He often intentionally scattered paperwork and drinks on his desk. And every time he saw Mary cleaning, he would make her do it again and again, until he was satisfied. But in reality, he was never satisfied. Derek wanted to assert his position, and Mary understood that he was doing this solely to affirm his absolute power over those he considered beneath him. Once, when Mary was collecting trash in Derek's office, he sat there coldly, staring at her, and saying something that made Mary feel as though her heart had been cut with a knife. "Why do we still hire useless old people like you? A robot vacuum could do a better job." Mary bowed her head, not replying. And the pain of those words deepened, as she realized that Derek didn't feel any remorse for his cruel, venomous comment. With each passing night, every time she faced indifference, Mary's heart grew heavier. She was not only heartbroken by Gerald's disrespect and Derek's cold contempt, but she was also tormented by the helpless silence of her fellow janitors, who couldn't defend themselves against this injustice. The toxic culture Mary was witnessing wasn't just a moral decline. It represented the rot that had taken root at the very foundation of the company she had once proudly built. But Mary was not discouraged. On the contrary, she became even more determined to uncover the truth behind the indifference and abuse of power. Because she knew, only by facing the deepest truth could she restore the lost soul of Williams Innovations, the company she had nurtured and cherished her entire life. The following days, The atmosphere at Williams Innovations seemed to grow more stifling than ever. For Mary, each day, stepping into the workplace, was no longer a source of pride, as it once had been, but a harsh challenge. Facing the bitter reality of what the company she had once loved and nurtured had become. Since she started disguising herself as Janet, Mary knew she would have to face difficulties. But she never expected them to be so merciless and direct. Especially from Gerald Hayes, the operations manager, who was becoming increasingly aggressive and oppressive. From their first encounter, Gerald left a lasting impression on Mary, with his cruelty hidden behind a polite exterior. However, the initial actions were just the beginning of the tense days to come. Gerald was like someone obsessed with perfection. But the perfection he demanded was not based on objective standards, but purely on the power he held in his hands. To Gerald, lower-level employees, especially janitors, were nothing more than small pieces on his personal power chessboard. One Wednesday evening, as Mary was finishing up cleaning the hallway on the 38th floor, Gerald suddenly appeared from behind. The hallway lights reflected off his face, casting a chilling, menacing look. When he spoke, his voice was so cold, it made Mary shiver slightly. "Are you done, Janet?" Mary calmly replied. "Yes, Mr. Hayes. Everything has been cleaned according to procedure." Gerald glanced around, his eyes seeming to scrutinize every corner of the hallway. Mary had just carefully cleaned. Unexpectedly, he stepped forward, pulled a small white cloth from his jacket pocket, and bent down to wipe a corner of the wall. Mary silently watched, waiting for the outcome of this surprise inspection. Gerald raised his head, holding the cloth high, and looked at Mary with a challenging gaze. "Is this what you call clean, Janet? I thought, by your age, you should know what clean looks like." Mary looked at the white cloth. It had no trace of dirt at all. But Gerald still acted as if it were the clearest proof of her laziness and irresponsibility. Gerald deliberately dropped the cloth onto the floor, then spoke again, with a mocking tone. "Clean this entire hallway again. And remember, if you want to keep your job, I don't want to see a single mistake, no matter how small." Mary silently lowered her head, patiently picking up the cloth and continuing her work. Gerald walked away with a small satisfied laugh, leaving her alone in the silent hallway, the weight of the moment pressing on her. But that wasn't the last time Gerald deliberately made things difficult for Mary. Just a few days later, when Mary was carefully cleaning the windows in the large conference room on the 40th floor, Gerald appeared again. This time, he brought a freshly brewed cup of hot coffee. Without saying a word, Gerald stepped over, stood next to Mary, looked out the window, and casually said, "Janet, do you know why people like you will always just be janitors?" Mary stopped her work, turned to face him, her gaze calm, but with a storm brewing inside. "No, sir." Gerald took a sip of his coffee, his voice light, but venomous. "Because people like you always accept mediocrity. You have no ambition, no capability, and no self-respect. You only do what's necessary. Never excellent." With those words, Gerald tilted the coffee cup slightly, letting dark drops of coffee fall onto the freshly cleaned floor that Mary had just scrubbed. Each drop felt like a bitter sting, straight to Mary's heart. But she silently watched, not saying a word in protest. Gerald placed the cup on the table. And gestured. "Clean it up, Janet. I want this place to be so clean. I can see my reflection in it." Mary patiently redid everything. Even though she knew, Gerald was intentionally tormenting her. In that moment, she understood, more deeply than ever before, the cruelty that janitorial staff had to endure every day. To Gerald, this abuse of power seemed like a sick pleasure. A way for him to demonstrate his superiority. And absolute control. Not stopping at those simple actions, Gerald became increasingly aggressive. He frequently made unreasonable and unfounded demands for Mary to redo tasks she had already completed excellently. She realized, Gerald was using her as an example to intimidate the entire janitorial staff. Gradually, Mary noticed the sympathetic glances of her coworkers. But no one dared to speak out in her defense. The atmosphere of fear and oppression that Gerald created grew more apparent. He wanted everyone to see him as someone to be feared. Someone who couldn't be opposed. To achieve this, he had no qualms about trampling on the dignity and self-respect of the lowest-ranking employees in the company. Those who had no ability to defend themselves. But what Gerald didn't know was that his actions were igniting a steely resolve in Mary. A determination, stronger than ever before. For Mary, every time she endured Gerald's insults, she silently promised herself that she would never let people like him continue to destroy the company she had built. Sooner or later, she would find a way to put an end to these inhumane and cruel actions. With that resolve, Mary quietly continued her work, waiting for the right moment to expose the dark truth about Gerald Hayes. The man who thought he was in control of everything, but was actually walking straight into the very power trap he had set for himself. The days working under Gerald's harsh supervision had gradually become a challenge that Mary thought she might never endure. But she constantly reminded herself of the bigger goal: to protect the soul and values of the company she had once dedicated her entire life to. Up until this point, despite Gerald's constant pressure, Mary had maintained her calm, trying not to let her emotions shake her plan. However, with each passing day, Gerald grew increasingly aggressive and showed his absolute power. Dissatisfied with merely having her repeat meaningless tasks, he began to publicly demean and humiliate her in front of other employees. It seemed that this only satisfied him more. Seeing her remain silent and endure. One weekend evening, after finishing the cleaning in the main office area, Mary was doing a final check when Gerald suddenly entered, followed by a few younger management staff, each of them watching with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Mary sensed something was wrong when she saw the cold look in Gerald's eyes, fixed on her. He walked closer, holding a cup of ice-cold water. Gerald's gaze now was not just the usual coldness she had grown accustomed to. It had turned into something more defiant and hostile, as if he had been waiting a long time for this moment. "Janet," Gerald spoke, his voice soft, yet full of sarcasm. "I hear you still don't understand the cleaning standards of this company." Mary gently lifted her head, trying to keep her voice as calm as possible. "I believe I followed the correct procedure, Mr. Hayes." Gerald smirked with disdain. "Oh, the correct procedure. Then why is it that every time I inspect, I always find such trivial yet disappointing shortcomings?" The younger employees behind them started to whisper among themselves, their looks a mixture of awkwardness and curiosity, directed at Gerald and Mary. The atmosphere in the room grew tense. And suffocating. As if everyone was waiting for something unpleasant to happen. Mary calmly responded. "I'll pay more attention, sir." Gerald chuckled lightly. But his laughter felt like a dangerous warning. Suddenly. He moved closer to Mary. His gaze lowering in contempt. "The problem isn't attention, Janet. The problem is ability. People like you should learn to accept that you can't do anything well." Before she could respond, Gerald suddenly splashed the icy cold water straight onto Mary's head. The cold water poured down her hair, over her face, and onto her collar, soaking into her uniform. The room went completely silent. Mary stood motionless, the cold water dripping down her face. But what truly hurt her, more than anything, was the ultimate humiliation. She was suffering. Right in the company she had once built with her own hands. The young employees witnessing this were shocked by Gerald's actions. But none dared to speak out or intervene. They were afraid. And it was this fear that Gerald wanted. He looked around, satisfied with the tense atmosphere he had created. Then turned to Mary. His voice filled with malice. "Now you have something to clean, Janet. Remember where you are. And who holds the power here." Gerald turned and walked away. The other employees immediately lowered their heads, avoiding eye contact with her, before quickly exiting the room, leaving Mary alone, with the overwhelming sense of bitterness and shame rising in her heart. When the door closed behind the last person, Mary slowly took a tissue to wipe her face, her hand trembling, not from the cold, but from the rage that had been suppressed to the point of suffocation. It had been a long time since Mary had felt so humiliated and hurt. In that brief moment, she wondered if this suffering was worth it. If she had the strength to continue on this difficult path ahead. But then, in the midst of her weakest moment, Mary suddenly remembered why she had started this journey. She thought about each small janitor, silently enduring similar things every day, but unable to speak out. She thought about Maria, with her eyes welling up in fear, when Gerald insulted her. About the bowed heads, the tired sighs, when they were made to do meaningless tasks over and over again. She knew that her endurance today wasn't just to expose Gerald. It was to reveal a much darker truth. The deep rot within the culture of a company that had once been a symbol of respect and equality. Mary wiped the water from her face, took a deep breath, and her eyes shone with determination and strength like never before. Gerald had no idea that the action he thought was an act of power and humiliation was actually the last straw, the final push that would make her even stronger in her fight against the injustice and abuse of power at Williams Innovations. In the silence, Mary made a promise to herself. She would never let today's humiliation and bitterness be in vain. Gerald might think he had won when he saw her soaked and humiliated. But he had no idea that his actions had sparked a fierce fire of determination inside her. From this moment on, Mary understood more clearly than ever before. She was not only fighting to regain her own value and dignity, but also to protect the voiceless, to stand up for those who silently endure every day, and to reclaim the true soul of Williams Innovations, her beloved creation. which she cherished more than anything else in the world. After the painful incident with Gerald, every step Mary took down the hallway of Williams Innovations felt heavier. Yet she remained steadfast in her plan, promising herself that the bitterness she endured would not be in vain. Mary knew that aside from Gerald, there were many others in the leadership team who were silently abusing their power just as ruthlessly. And among them, the most prominent was Derek Phillips. The young, ambitious, and cold marketing director. Derek Phillips was the type of young manager often featured in business magazines, with a polished smile and perfectly crafted success stories. But behind this glamorous facade, Mary began to see a completely different person. Derek wasn't just arrogant and cold. He also held disdain for anyone he deemed inferior to him. To Derek, the existence of janitorial staff like Mary was simply to serve and endure every insult without the right to respond. From the very first days that Mary entered the company under the name Janet, Derek had shown clear discomfort at seeing her work near his office. But as time passed, Derek's attitude grew increasingly extreme and aggressive. While Gerald openly tormented Mary with direct actions, Derek employed a more subtle method. He created difficult situations, intentionally made messes, and forced Mary to repeat her work over and over, aiming to wear her down and make her feel helpless. One evening, at the start of the week, after Mary had just finished cleaning the large meeting room for the marketing department, Derek walked in, glanced around, and slowly shook his head, his eyes showing clear disappointment. "Janet, I really don't understand why you always do such sloppy work." Mary looked around the perfectly cleaned room, having meticulously wiped every surface, and responded in a calm voice. "I followed the company's standards, Mr. Phillips." Derek smirked coldly, walked over to the meeting table, and deliberately knocked a few chairs that Mary had neatly arranged, causing several stacks of paper to fall to the floor. "You call this standard?" he mocked. "Really disappointing, Janet. Do it all again." Mary quietly bent down to pick up the paper, rearranged the chairs, trying her best not to show the frustration rising inside her. But Derek didn't stop there. After she finished for the second time, Derek returned, holding a full cup of coffee. He stood at a distance, watching her with a nonchalant, mocking expression. Then, suddenly, walked over and placed the coffee cup heavily on the table, causing the coffee to spill all over the freshly cleaned surface. "Oh, sorry, Janet," Derek said with sarcastic sweetness. "I've bothered you again. Clean this spot properly now. And this time, be more careful." Mary silently wiped the table again, her movements careful, hiding the anger and humiliation building up within her. But Derek was still unsatisfied. After she placed the rag down, he walked around the room, swiping his hand along a decorative picture frame. Then nonchalantly looked at Mary, his voice colder than before. "You know, Janet, they say old age brings wisdom. But it seems that doesn't apply to you, does it? This is what you call clean. You think the company pays you to do this half-heartedly?" Mary bit back the hurt and continued to wipe again. But every time Derek spoke, every unreasonable demand he made, Mary's stress grew. Derek was clearly pushing her wearing down her patience and endurance. Not only that, Derek frequently demanded Mary clean his private office. While he continued to work late, Mary couldn't ignore the fact that Derek wanted her to endure psychological stress, constantly being watched so closely. There were times when he just sat silently, his eyes fixed on her every movement, without saying a word. The atmosphere in the room became suffocating. And Mary understood that Derek was deliberately creating invisible pressure, making her a prey, trapped in his cruel psychological game. These actions went on continuously, day after day, causing Mary to feel tense and anxious. Every time she had to face Derek, she never imagined that she, once the head of the entire corporation, would one day feel fear, just from seeing an underling of her own company. But it was Derek's indifference and coldness that gradually pushed Mary into a state of extreme tension. What hurt Mary even more was witnessing the indifferent attitude of other young managers who did nothing in response to Derek's outrageous behavior. They stood by, seeing the injustice, but no one dared to speak up to defend her, as they too were engulfed in fear and the culture of oppression. It was this indifferent attitude that made Mary realize that Derek wasn't the only one. He was just a representative of the decay and coldness that had deeply rooted itself in the core of the company. Mary realized that Derek was using his power as a weapon, creating fear and subjugation in those weaker than him. His actions were not just personal indifference. They were a symbol of a work environment that was increasingly losing compassion and understanding. However, the more she faced this cruelty and apathy, the more Mary understood her mission. She couldn't let people like Derek continue to exist without being exposed. Her suffering, though painful and filled with tension, was an essential part of protecting the soul of Williams Innovations once and for all. After enduring the relentless cruelty of Gerald and Derek for several days, Mary began to realize that the tension was gradually surpassing her limits. She understood that in order to assess the severity of the issue, she needed to find out whether the company's internal system was still strong enough to protect its employees. With this thought in mind, Mary made a bold decision to meet with Karen Mitchell, the Human Resources Director of Williams Innovations, who was directly responsible for safeguarding the rights and safety of the staff. Karen Mitchell was a well-known figure in the human resources field, with nearly 20 years of experience. She was famous for her strict leadership style, always placing the company's interests above all else. However, Mary remembered that in the past, Karen had been a manager who was dedicated and genuinely concerned about every employee, no matter their position. For that reason, Mary had high hopes for this meeting, although she still felt a bit hesitant, thinking about the possibility of disappointment. That afternoon, Mary gathered her courage and walked into the Human Resources office on the 20th floor. The office was tastefully arranged, cozy, with lush green plants and framed pictures of outstanding employees hanging neatly on the walls as proof of an ideal work environment. But Mary knew that the truth was sometimes far from the polished exterior. Karen Mitchell sat behind a large desk, her blonde hair neatly tied up, her sharp features and stern glasses, giving her a professional and reliable appearance. At first glance, Karen radiated professionalism and trustworthiness. But the coldness in her eyes seemed to have lost the warmth Mary once knew. Upon seeing Mary enter, Karen merely glanced up briefly, before turning back to her computer screen, as if Mary didn't exist. "What do you need?" Karen spoke in a calm voice. But there was a distinct coldness. Mary gently replied, "I'm here to report some serious issues that I and several other janitorial staff have been enduring recently." Karen paused, looking up at Mary more intently. Her expression a mixture of surprise and slight annoyance. "You're Janet, the night shift janitor, right?" Karen asked, purposely emphasizing the word janitor, as a reminder of Mary's position. Mary nodded calmly. "Yes, I'm Janet. I would like to report the mistreatment and humiliation that I and my colleagues have been subjected to by some of the senior management." Karen silently observed Mary for a few seconds, then crossed her arms, sighed, and said, "All right, Janet. Keep it brief. I have many important things to do." Mary felt a bit deflated by this attitude, but still maintained a polite tone. "Specifically, Gerald Hayes and Derek Phillips. They continuously make unreasonable demands, forcing us to redo tasks over and over again, deliberately creating situations to publicly humiliate us in front of others." Karen raised an eyebrow, her gaze cold and skeptical. "Are you sure you're not overreacting, Janet? In the workplace, sometimes leaders have to be strict to ensure work quality. This isn't anything new." Mary stayed calm and explained further. "I understand that. But their actions go beyond what is acceptable. Gerald publicly poured cold water on my head, and Derek intentionally made a mess to make me redo tasks multiple times. That's not strictness. That's bullying and degrading our dignity." Karen side-glanced at her watch and shrugged casually. "I understand how you feel, Janet. But you need to look at things realistically. This is a competitive business environment, and sometimes, small hurts are inevitable. If you're feeling upset, I suggest you adapt, instead of being overly sensitive to situations like this." Mary stood silent, struck by Karen's cold and irresponsible response. She tried once more, hoping for a slim chance. "Doesn't the HR department have any policies in place to protect low-level employees like us?" Karen frowned in irritation, her voice growing colder. "We are, of course, always ready to protect employees. But you need to understand your position and role. If everyone came here to complain about small issues, this company would never grow. You're a janitor. Your job is to do your tasks well, not to come up here and complain about the harshness of the work." Mary stood motionless, her heart aching at Karen's dismissive and indifferent attitude. She realized that the person she had once hoped would be her final support had completely changed. Karen was no longer the passionate and fair HR manager she once knew, but had become a part of the heartless machinery, indifferent to the injustice occurring right before her eyes. Karen emphasized once more, her voice cold and blunt. "Janet, remember that this company hired you to clean, not to evaluate or comment on the management's leadership methods. I hope you won't waste any more of our time." Mary tried to remain composed, bowed her head, and left the office. In that moment, She understood how deeply rotten the company culture had become. This crushing disappointment didn't just come from Gerald or Derek's attitudes, but also from the Human Resources Department, which should have been the last refuge for the most vulnerable employees. Mary silently walked toward the elevator, her heart heavy with the bitter feeling of betrayal. But she also understood that Karen's coldness had only clarified her mission. She couldn't just rely on the internal system to change the situation. Mary knew that to restore the true values of Williams' innovations, she would have to expose people like Karen, Gerald, and Derek. Those quietly destroying the very foundation she had worked so hard to build. Mary walked out of the Human Resources office, her heart heavy with disappointment. The small hopes she had placed in Karen Mitchell, in the department that was supposed to protect employees' rights, had shattered completely. Now, Mary understood that she was utterly alone in the fight to defend the values and soul of the company she had once devoted her life to building. A few days had passed since the crushing disappointment with Karen, and Mary continued her work quietly. But the feeling of loneliness and exhaustion was becoming more and more evident on her face. Each night, as she walked into the company, under the dim light of the hallway, Mary no longer felt at home here, as she once did. Instead, it felt like stepping into a hostile territory, where every gaze was filled with contempt and indifference. One evening, Mary was tasked with cleaning the large conference room on the 44th floor, where the senior leadership often held their end-of-day meetings. The room was spacious and luxurious, with exquisite wood furnishings and high-end leather chairs. Mary always took care to follow the established cleaning procedures, because she knew that no matter how well she did her job, even the smallest mistake could be used as an excuse for the senior managers to humiliate her again. That night, as Mary was carefully cleaning the conference table, the door to the room suddenly swung open. Veronica Wells, the vice president of business, entered with a group of lower-level employees, carrying documents. Veronica, in her 40s, was dressed in formal attire, her commanding presence evident in her every gesture and sharp, authoritative gaze. As she entered, Veronica scanned the room, her face showing clear signs of displeasure. Upon seeing Mary still in the room, "Janet, why are you still here at this hour?" Veronica's voice was cold, full of reproach. Mary quickly responded politely. "Sorry, Mrs. Wells. I'm just following the pre-scheduled cleaning routine. I'll be done in just a few minutes." But Veronica did not accept Mary's explanation. Her gaze grew more intense. "What do you think you're doing? Bothering us while we're preparing for such an important meeting? Who gave you permission to interfere with the leadership's work?" Mary tried to explain again, her voice remaining calm and respectful. "I truly apologize if there's any inconvenience, but this is the procedure set by the operations department. I'm just doing my job." Veronica cut her off, her eyes blazing with anger. "Are you daring to argue with me, Janet? Have you forgotten your place?" The room fell silent, the tension almost suffocating. The employees with Veronica all lowered their heads, none of them daring to intervene. Mary stood there, trying to maintain her composure. But she could never have anticipated what would happen next. Something far beyond what she could imagine. Veronica quickly walked toward her. the sound of her high heels sharply echoing against the floor. Without hesitation, Veronica raised her hand and slapped Mary across the face. The sudden force of the slap made Mary stagger backward, her cleaning tools falling to the floor with a loud clatter. The burning pain spread across her cheek. But what hurt more than the physical pain was the crushing sense of humiliation, as she realized that all eyes in the room were on her. Veronica looked at Mary with deep disdain, her voice cold and ruthless. "You need to remember who you are and what position you hold in this company. If you ever dare to defy me again, I'll make sure you regret it." No one in the room spoke or reacted. The employees behind Veronica remained silent, avoiding looking at Mary, as though she were an invisible object, not worth their attention. Mary felt the tears welling up, but she struggled to swallow the shame and pain deep within her. In that haunting moment of silence, Mary suddenly realized a bitter truth. The company she had built, with all her faith in kindness and respect, had now become a place where people like Veronica could openly abuse their power and trample on the dignity of others without fear of consequence. The pain from Veronica's slap served as a harsh reminder to Mary of the complete corruption that her once proud company was now facing. But in that very moment, something important shifted within her. That humiliating slap not only made her realize the severity of the situation, but also awakened a strong determination within Mary that she could no longer remain silent. As Veronica and the others left the conference room, Mary stood up, gently wiping the tears that had fallen down her cheeks. The pain on her face was still raw, but inside, her resolve burned brighter than ever before. Mary knew that the time to act decisively had come. She could no longer allow herself, or anyone else, to endure this cruel injustice for even one more day. Looking around the now empty conference room, Mary whispered to herself that she would not let her sacrifice and suffering be in vain. The moment of pain and humiliation she had just experienced was not only the final limit she could accept, it was the starting point for a fierce, resolute battle to protect the soul of Williams Innovations, and more importantly, to defend the right to live and work with dignity for all those who were being overlooked and trampled on every day in this company. After the painful and humiliating slap from Veronica, Mary returned home with a stronger determination than ever before. That bitter moment not only awakened her, but also marked an important turning point. She realized it was time to take decisive action, not only to protect her own dignity, but also to save the very soul of the company she had poured her heart into building. Mary realized that relying only on words or complaints would not bring about any change. She needed clear, solid evidence. With that in mind, Mary decided to use recording devices and small cameras secretly attached to her cleaning trolley and her uniform to gather the most concrete evidence of the misconduct by the senior leadership team. In the following nights, Mary continued to play the role of Janet flawlessly, quietly observing and silently recording every suspicious word and action. Her carefulness and subtlety allowed her to quickly uncover a truth far more terrifying than she had imagined. One late night, While Mary was cleaning the executive office, she accidentally overheard a tense, whispered conversation coming from the small meeting room at the end of the 42nd floor corridor. Curious, Mary quietly approached, her recording device ready to capture every word. Inside the room, Mary immediately recognized familiar voices. Gerald Hayes, Derek Phillips, Veronica Wells, and Karen Mitchell, all present. Her heart pounded as she realized that the four most powerful people she had once faced were now secretly meeting together. She stood quietly by the door, the voices growing clearer from within. "We no longer have time to hesitate." Gerald's voice was the first to sound, cold and decisive. "Robert is starting to suspect. If we don't act soon, the whole plan will fall apart." Veronica spoke up confidently. "Robert is too weak to lead this company. We need a stronger leader. Someone who can take the company in the right direction. The direction that benefits us." Karen added, her voice filled with calculation. "I've prepared all the internal documents and financial information. Just a few more steps, and all the evidence will show that Robert is not capable of leading. At that point, the board will have no choice but to fire him." Derek interjected with disdain. "Let's finish this plan quickly. We need to move more budget into the subsidiary companies we control before everything gets exposed." Mary stood outside the door, her heart freezing. With each word she heard, she couldn't believe that these four key figures in the company she and Robert had trusted so much were now plotting betrayal. Not only were they bullying and oppressing lower-level employees, but they were also preparing a plan to overthrow Robert, her beloved and trusted successor. The conversation continued, and Mary began to understand the full scope of the conspiracy. Gerald kept emphasizing, "When Robert steps down, I'll take over as CEO. The senior positions will go to you. At that point, we will have full control over Williams' innovations, and no one will be able to stop us." Derek's cold laugh echoed, filled with satisfaction. "Then we'll easily partner with competitors to rake in more profits. Remember, money is what matters most, not the flowery ideals about ethics that Mary and Robert have always preached." At this point, Mary felt the deep pain and anger rising within her. But she knew she could not let her emotions cloud her judgment. She moved carefully, maintaining absolute silence, ensuring the recording devices and cameras continued to capture every word and action. Inside the room, the conversation ended, and the group inside left the room one by one, completely unaware that everything they had just discussed had been secretly recorded by Mary. Once they were gone, Mary slowly stood up, her steps slightly shaky from what she had just heard, but her resolve also growing stronger. Returning home, in a state of both shock and determination, Mary carefully reviewed all the evidence she had collected. The video clips, the clear audio recordings of Gerald, Derek, Veronica, and Karen's dark and ambitious conspiracy played out before her. These were no longer just indifferent, ruthless managers. They had become dangerous traitors, ready to destroy the company from the inside, to satisfy their own insatiable greed. Mary sat silently in the small room, her mind spinning with thoughts. This was no longer just a personal matter, or her own pain. This was the future and destiny Of the entire company. Of the honest workers. Who labored day and night. At Williams Innovations. She knew. She could no longer hesitate. For even a moment. The secret plan. The recording devices. The sacrifices made along the way. All of these had led her to one final choice. To take decisive action. To protect her son. To protect the company she had once cherished. And to defend the innocent employees who were being trampled every day. In that moment of decision, Mary knew the battle ahead would be brutal and full of risks. But she also understood there was no other way. With the evidence in hand, she was determined to rise up, ready to expose all the dark truths about Gerald, Derek, Veronica, and Karen. Those she had once considered colleagues, but who had now become the most dangerous enemies, quietly sabotaging everything she loved and held dear. After what she discovered in the private meeting room, Mary realized there was no time to hesitate any longer. She couldn't handle everything on her own. She needed to speak directly with Robert, the only person she trusted now, and the one who was becoming the main target in the insidious plot of the traitors right beside him. Mary had never imagined that one day she would have to face her own son in such a difficult situation. Throughout her secret journey, she had tried to keep her identity hidden, so she could observe the situation as truthfully as possible. But the current circumstances no longer allowed her to keep the secret any longer. Mary decided to meet with Robert privately to reveal all the truth she had worked hard to uncover over the past few days. The meeting took place on a late afternoon in Robert's quiet apartment in the city center. When Robert opened the door and saw Mary standing there, a brief moment of confusion flashed across his face. But it quickly turned into joy and surprise. "Mom, what are you doing here?" Without warning, Mary stepped in, embraced her son tightly, feeling a rare sense of peace she hadn't experienced in a long time. Robert immediately sensed something unusual in his mother's expression, and his eyes grew more concerned. "What's going on, Mom? Why do you seem so tense?" Mary gently sat down on the sofa, trying to calm herself. Then looked directly into Robert's eyes, her voice serious and full of emotion. "Robert, I'm here today because there's something extremely important I need to tell you. Please listen carefully to what I'm about to say." Robert nodded, a vague sense of unease rising in him as he noticed how serious his mother was. Mary took a deep breath, then slowly revealed the truth she had kept hidden all this time. "Recently, I secretly returned to Williams Innovations under the guise of a janitor named Janet." Robert was stunned, unable to believe what he had just heard. His face showed shock. "What did you say? What did you do? Why would you do that?" Mary continued calmly, gently explaining further. "I've heard a lot of bad rumors about the company culture and the management policies lately. I didn't want to believe them, but I needed to verify it myself. So I disguised myself to observe the situation from the inside." Robert sat in stunned silence, unable to hide his astonishment that his mother had gone to such extremes. Mary looked deeply into Robert's eyes, then gently placed her hand on his shoulder, her voice growing stronger. "But what I discovered, Robert, is far worse than I ever imagined. It's not just the disregard for lower-level employees. The indifference and the cruelty. I also uncovered a very serious betrayal plot. Robert frowned. His face filled with confusion and concern. A betrayal plot? What do you mean? Mary slowly took a small USB drive from her pocket and placed it on the table in front of Robert. I've gathered all the evidence, including audio recordings and videos, clearly proving that Gerald Hayes, Derek Phillips, Veronica Wells, and even Karen Mitchell, people whom you and I trusted wholeheartedly, are planning to force you to resign as CEO and then take full control of the company. Robert was shocked, his face turning pale. He sat still for a few seconds, his eyes fixed on the USB in front of him. The people he had once considered close allies, the ones he met and trusted every day, were actually the ones preparing to stab him in the back with a fatal blow. Robert picked up the USB, his gaze shifting from doubt to deep pain. Are you sure about this? Could it be a misunderstanding? Mary took Robert's hand, gently but firmly. I wish this were just a misunderstanding, son. But the evidence I have is very clear. I've heard them discussing and planning everything myself. I didn't want to believe it. But it's the truth. I can't deny it. Robert lowered his head, his eyes showing the deep sorrow of realizing he had trusted the wrong people. I can't believe it. The people I placed all my trust in, betraying me so coldly like this. Mary tightened her grip on Robert's hand, looking deeply into his eyes, and softly said, with determination, we can't just sit here and suffer, Robert. We need to stand strong and take action. Not just to protect your interests, but to protect this company. To protect all the innocent employees who work day and night at Williams Innovations. Robert raised his head, his eyes gradually becoming more resolute. The shock and pain giving way to a strong determination. You're right. We can't let them keep acting like this. We have to bring everything to light. Mary smiled softly, relieved to see her son regain his composure and determination to act. She knew the upcoming battle would be incredibly difficult and tense. But now, she was no longer alone. She and Robert would stand together to expose all the dark and malicious truths in the eyes of the mother and son. At that moment, there was no longer any doubt or pain from betrayal. Only a strong resolve to fight for what was right. To reclaim the soul and true values of Williams Innovations from those ready to destroy it all for their own insatiable greed. In the months that followed, the culture at Williams Innovations began to change. Slowly, but surely. It started with simple things. Robert made it a point to eat lunch in the common cafeteria once a week. Not in the executive dining room. Not in some corner office. But among everyone. Employees. Janitors. Receptionists. Interns. His presence spoke louder than any press release ever could. Respect was being rebuilt. New HR policies were introduced. Ones that protected not just top-tier staff, but everyone. Zero-tolerance rules against abuse and harassment were enforced with actual consequences. Mary had suggested something else, and Robert agreed immediately. An anonymous reporting system, run by a third party, to ensure accountability and real safety. Because Mary knew That fear didn't go away. Just because a few people were fired. You had to build trust. Every day. With every action. A new training program was launched. Led by external coaches. On ethics, communication. And inclusive leadership. The first session was mandatory for all managers. No exceptions. Even Robert attended. Sitting side by side. With junior team leads. The message was clear. This was no longer a company. Where power made you untouchable. This was a place. Where everyone mattered. One of the biggest internal changes. Came from Mary's suggestion. It was called Ground Floor Week. For 5 days each year. Every executive. From directors to vice presidents. Had to spend one shift. Working a frontline role. Cleaning. Filing. Answering phones. Making deliveries. Whatever needed to be done. They did it. It wasn't punishment. It was perspective. At first. Some protested. Argued. Tried to get out of it. But Robert held firm. If my mother could mop these floors for weeks. To save this company. You can do it for one day. To understand it. And so they did. Veronica's replacement. A smart, rising leader named Priya. Spent her ground floor week. Working beside Maria. The janitor who had once been scolded. And belittled by the old guard. At the end of that week. Priya asked Maria. How have you stayed so kind? In a place that wasn't always kind to you? Maria smiled. Because not everyone is bad. And I always believed someone would care. One day. Priya teared up. And later nominated Maria. For the new annual Heart of the Company award. Maria won. Standing on stage. In front of hundreds of applauding employees. She held her trophy with shaking hands. And said. I used to think people like me didn't matter. But now. I know we do. Thank you. The crowd stood. Applauding for minutes. Not because of her job title. But because of her spirit. Mary, standing at the back. Felt her heart swell. This was what she had fought for. Not just a clean boardroom. But a clean culture. One that honored everyone. Outside the company. News of the internal transformation. Spread quickly. Media outlets ran headlines like CEO's mom goes undercover to save company culture. From janitor to justice, how one woman rebuilt a business ethically. Mary refused every interview. Every TV offer. Every book deal. This wasn't about fame. She told Robert. This was about doing the right thing. But her story inspired many. Other companies reached out. Asking how they could implement similar reforms. Robert created a downloadable guide. Building culture from the ground up. And published it free. On the company website. No paywall. No required sign-up. Because they weren't trying to profit from it. They were trying to share it. Months turned into a year. And that year became 2. Williams Innovations was not just profitable again. It was praised across industries. For ethical leadership. For how it treated its people. Turnover dropped. Productivity rose. Clients took notice. New partnerships formed. And more importantly. Employees smiled again. They came in early. Stayed a little late. Not because they were afraid. But because they believed. One winter morning. Mary returned to the office. For an event she hadn't expected. Robert had arranged a private ceremony. In her honor. It wasn't publicized. There were no journalists. Just the employees. The heart of the company. One by one, people stood and shared stories of what had changed. Maria, the IT intern who now led a team. A receptionist promoted to HR. A night security guard, whose poetry was published because of an employee showcase Mary had suggested. And then Robert stood up, holding a box. He smiled at his mother. You taught me that leadership isn't about power. It's about people. He opened the box, revealing a gold-engraved plaque. It read, Mary Williams, founder, protector, and heart of Williams Innovations. Mary stepped forward, her hands slightly trembling, as she accepted it. I built this company with dreams in my eyes and fire in my heart, she said. But I almost lost sight of it. Because even a strong foundation can crack if you stop watching, stop caring. I was gone. But the rot crept in. And it wasn't until I looked through the eyes of those we forget that I saw clearly again. She paused, looked around the room, then added, never let titles make you forget that every person matters. From the corner office to the break room, from the engineer to the janitor. This company is only strong when we stand together. The room rose to its feet. Applause filled the space. Mary stood quietly, tears in her eyes. Not from sadness, but from peace. She had fought. She had endured. She had changed the ending. And now, she could rest. The company was no longer just hers. It was everyone's. And that was the greatest legacy of all.